The wind howled like a wild animal that night, shaking the small wooden cabin until the walls creaked and groaned. Grace pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she sat by the dying fire, listening to the storm rage outside. Winter had come early to the Dakota Territory, and it was proving to be one of the harshest she had ever seen. She had been living alone in the cabin for almost 8 months now, ever since her husband passed away from the fever. The loneliness had become her constant companion, broken only by the occasional visit from neighbors who lived miles away. Most nights she would sit by the window, watching the endless prairie stretch out under the stars, wondering if she had made the right choice staying here. Instead of returning east to her sister's family, the pounding on her door came just after midnight. At first, Grace thought it was just a tree branch blown against the cabin by the fierce wind. But then it came again, more desperate this time. 3 hard knocks that seemed to echo through her bones. Her heart began to race. Who could be out in this weather? The nearest neighbor was old Henry, and he lived 5 miles away. No one traveled at night during storms like this, especially not with all the trouble that had been happening between the settlers and the local tribes. Grace grabbed the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Her hands shook as she approached the door. The knocking came again, weaker this time, followed by what sounded like a man's voice calling out words she couldn't understand. "Who's there?" She called through the thick wooden door. The response came in broken English, mixed with words in another language. "Please ... baby ... Grace's breath caught in her throat. Did she hear that right? Someone was asking for help, and they mentioned a baby? She pressed her ear against the door, trying to make out more words through the howling wind. "Please, lady, baby cold ... dying ... The voice was getting weaker. Grace realized that whoever was out there might collapse at any moment. She had heard stories of people freezing to death just steps away from shelter during prairie storms. But she had also heard stories of attacks on isolated cabins, of people being tricked into opening their doors. She stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, her hand on the door latch, torn between fear and compassion. Then she heard it, the unmistakable cry of an infant, weak and desperate. That sound broke through all her fear. Grace had lost her own baby boy just 2 years ago, and she knew that cry. It was the sound of a child in distress, and nothing else mattered. She lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door and pulled it open. The sight that met her eyes would stay with her for the rest of her life. A young man, probably no more than 25, stood swaying on her doorstep. His long black hair was matted with blood, and his clothes were torn and stained dark red. He was clearly a member of the Lakota tribe, though Grace had never seen one up close before, but what made her gasp was the tiny bundle he held pressed against his chest. A baby, wrapped in what looked like a blood-stained blanket, was crying weakly in his arms. The man's eyes, even through his obvious pain and exhaustion, held a desperate plea that needed no translation. "Please," he whispered in English, swaying. On his feet, "Save baby." Grace didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and caught the man just as he began to fall, helping him stumble into the cabin. The baby's cries grew stronger as they moved into the warmth, and Grace could see it was probably only a few months old. The man collapsed onto the floor near the fireplace, but even as he fell, he kept the baby protected in his arms. Grace quickly shut the door against the storm and rushed to build up the fire. The cabin was already warm, but she knew they would need more heat to fight off the cold that had seeped into their bones. As the fire blazed higher, Grace could see the full extent of the man's injuries. There was a deep cut on his forehead and what looked like a bullet wound in his shoulder. His clothes were not just torn, but seemed to have been shredded by something sharp. Blood had dried on his skin, mixing with dirt and sweat, but his eyes never left the baby. Even in his weakened state, his first concern was for the child in his arms. Grace knelt beside them, her fear completely forgotten now. "Let me see," she said softly, reaching for the baby. The man hesitated for just a moment, then carefully placed the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby was a boy, probably 3 or 4 months old. His skin was cold to the touch, but his breathing was strong. He had stopped crying now that he was warm and was looking up at Grace with the most beautiful dark eyes she had ever seen. "What's his name?" Grace asked, but the man didn't seem to understand. She tried pointing to the baby and then to herself, saying, "Grace," to indicate her own name. The man's eyes lit up with understanding. He placed a weak hand on the baby's chest and said something in Lakota. Then, struggling with the English words, he said, "Womble, name ... Don Blombley." Grace repeated the name softly, Wombley. It sounded musical, even though she didn't know what it meant. The man nodded, then pointed to himself. "Dakota," he said, then seemed to struggle to find more English words. "Uncle ... one bli ... uncle," Grace began to understand. This man, Dakota, was the baby's uncle, but where were the parents? And how had they ended up at her door in the middle of a blizzard, both of them covered in blood? As if reading her thoughts, Dakota's expression grew dark. He said something in Lakota that sounded angry and sad at the same time. Then, with great effort, he spoke in broken English. "Soldiers ... came ... village ... doggone." Grace felt her heart sink. She had heard rumors of conflicts between the army and local tribes, but she had never imagined anything like this. She looked down at little Wombley, who was now peacefully sleeping in her arms, and realized that this child might be the only survivor of whatever terrible thing had happened. "Your family?" she asked gently. Dakota's eyes filled with tears. He shook his head and said something in Lakota that she didn't need to understand. The pain in his voice told her everything. Grace made a decision that would change all of their lives. She stood up, still holding Wombley, and said, "You're safe now, both of you." Dakota looked at her with surprise. In his experience, white settlers were not known for their kindness to his people. The fact that this woman had not only let them in but was now offering them safety was almost beyond his understanding. Grace went to her bedroom and returned with clean blankets and her late husband's clothes. She helped Dakota to the couch near the fireplace and began to clean his wounds. As she worked, she found herself thinking about how strange life could be. Just hours ago, she had been sitting alone, feeling sorry for herself. Now she had two people depending on her, and for the first time in months, she felt like she had a purpose. The baby, Wombley, began to stir and cry softly. Grace realized he was probably hungry, but what could she feed him? She had no milk in the cabin, and even if she did, a baby this young would need mother's milk. Then she remembered something that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Her own body had not yet forgotten the child she had lost. She had been binding her chest to stop the milk that still came. But now she wondered if perhaps there was a reason for everything that had happened tonight. As the storm continued to rage outside, Grace made another decision that would scandalize her neighbors if they ever found out. She would feed this child, this little Lakota boy who had lost everything, and she would do whatever it took to keep both him and his uncle alive. She looked at Dakota, who was now sleeping fitfully by the fire, and at little Wombley, who was looking up at her with complete trust. These two souls had been brought to her door by fate, and she was not going to let them down. The storm outside might be fierce, but inside the little cabin, three people who had all lost everything were about to discover that sometimes the most unlikely families are the strongest ones of all. 2 weeks had passed since that stormy night, and Grace's life had completely changed. The small cabin that once felt empty and cold now buzzed with quiet activity. Dakota was recovering slowly, spending most of his days in the barn where Grace had made a comfortable space for him. She knew having him in the main house would raise too many questions if anyone came visiting. Every morning, Grace would wake to the sound of little Wombley making soft baby noises in the wooden crate she had turned into a makeshift crib. The sight of his tiny face always brought a smile to her lips. She had forgotten how much joy a baby could bring to a home. Dakota's wounds were healing well, thanks to Grace's careful nursing. She had learned to clean and bandage cuts from taking care of her late husband during his final illness. But Dakota's injuries were different. They told a story of violence that made Grace's heart ache every time she saw them. The bullet wound in his shoulder was the worst. Grace had to dig the bullet out herself on the third day with Dakota. biting down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. She had never done anything like that before, but she had no choice. The nearest doctor was in town, 40 miles away, and she couldn't risk taking Dakota there. During those early days, communication was difficult. Dakota spoke very little English, and Grace knew no Lakota words at all. But somehow they managed to understand each other. Dakota would point to things and say the Lakota word, then Grace would repeat it back to him. In return, she would teach him the English words. Water, Grace would say, holding up a cup. I, Dakota would respond, and Grace would try to copy his pronunciation. These language lessons usually happened during the evening, after Grace had finished her daily chores and Dakota had rested. Little Wombly would lie on a blanket between them, grabbing at their fingers and making happy gurgling sounds. Grace learned that Wombly meant eagle in Lakota. When Dakota told her this, his eyes filled with pride. He explained, using gestures and the few English words he knew, that eagles were sacred to his people. They were symbols of strength and freedom. Strong boy, Dakota would say, touching Wombly's tiny hand. Like eagle. But it was the feeding situation that brought Grace and Dakota closer together, and also created the most difficult moments for Grace. Little Wombly needed milk, and Grace was the only one who could provide it. The first time she nursed Wombly, Grace's hands shook with nervousness. She had sent Dakota outside to chop wood, wanting privacy for something that felt so personal. But when Wombly latched on and began to drink, Grace felt a rush of emotions she hadn't experienced since losing her own child. It felt natural and right, even though she knew what the neighbors would think if they ever found out. A white woman nursing a Native American baby was something that would shock the entire community. But Grace didn't care about what others might think. This baby needed her, and she needed him just as much. Dakota seemed to understand what Grace was doing for Wombly, and his gratitude was obvious in his eyes every time he looked at her. Sometimes Grace would catch him watching her with Wombly, and she could see emotions playing across his face that he couldn't put into words. One evening, as Grace was feeding Wombly by the firelight, Dakota spoke quietly in English. "Why you help?" "U.S.?" Grace looked up, surprised. It was the longest sentence he had spoken in English so far. "Because you needed help," she said simply. Dakota shook his head. "Your people ... Not friends." Grace knew what he meant. The relationship between settlers and native tribes was complicated and often violent. Most people in her situation would have turned them away, or worse. "I don't care about that," Grace said. "I only care about what's right." Dakota was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You good woman? Wombly lucky?" As the days passed, Grace began to look forward to Dakota's company. He was gentle and thoughtful, very different from what she had expected based on the stories she had heard about native warriors. He helped with chores around the cabin without being asked, chopping wood, repairing things that had been broken for months. He also showed her things she had never known about living on the prairie. Dakota taught her which plants were good for medicine and which ones were dangerous. He showed her how to read the weather by watching the behavior of birds and animals. One afternoon, while Wombly was napping, Dakota gestured for Grace to follow him outside. He led her to a spot near the creek where several plants were growing. "For baby," he said, pointing to a plant with small white flowers, "make strong." Grace watched as Dakota carefully picked some leaves and showed her how to prepare them. He pantomimed brewing tea and then drinking it, then pointed to Grace's chest. "For milk," he said, and Grace understood. This plant would help her produce more milk for Wanbli. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Grace deeply. Dakota was not just grateful for her help. He was actively trying to help her care for Wombly better. As they walked back to the cabin, Grace found herself really looking at Dakota for the first time. He was probably close to her age, maybe a little younger. His face, now that the swelling had gone down, was strong and kind. His eyes held a sadness that Grace recognized, the look of someone who had lost people they loved. "Your family," Grace said gently as they reached the cabin. "Tell me about them." Dakota's expression grew heavy. He sat down on the wooden steps and was quiet for a long time. Grace sat beside him, waiting. Finally, he began to speak in a mixture of English and Lakota. Grace understood most of what he was trying to say. Wombley's parents had been Dakotas. Sister and her husband. They lived in a small village with about 30 other families. Life had been peaceful there. Then the soldiers came. Dakota's voice broke as he described what happened. There had been trouble with some young warriors from another tribe, and the army had decided to punish all the native people in the area. They attacked the village at dawn, when most people were still sleeping. I was hunting, Dakota said, his English becoming clearer as the story went on. Heard guns. Ran back too late. Grace felt tears coming to her eyes as she listened. Dakota had returned to find his village burning and his family dead. He had searched through the smoke and flames, and found Wombley hidden under his mother's body. She had died protecting her baby. Only me and Wombley left, Dakota said quietly. Took horse, rode all night. Storm came, horse died. Walked, carrying Wombley, found your light. Grace understood now why they had been covered in blood when they arrived. It wasn't just from Dakota's injuries, it was from the terrible scene he had witnessed. I'm so sorry, Grace whispered. Dakota nodded. Now you understand. Wombley has no one, only me. But I don't know how to care for baby. He has both of us now, Grace said firmly. That night, as Grace fed Wombley and Dakota sat nearby mending one of her broken tools, she realized that something had changed between them. They were no longer just a woman helping strangers. They were becoming a family, but Grace also knew that this peaceful time couldn't last forever. Eventually, someone would come looking for them, or neighbors would start asking questions. She had seen smoke from other cabins in the distance, and she knew people would soon notice that she wasn't making her usual trips to town for supplies. The thought scared her, but it also made her more determined. She had found something precious. In this unlikely situation, a purpose, a family, and a kind of happiness she had thought was lost forever. As she tucked Wombley into his crib that night, Grace made a silent promise. Whatever happened next, she would protect this baby and the man who had brought him to her door. They had all lost so much, but together, maybe they could build something new. Outside, the prairie wind blew gently through the grass, carrying with it the promise of spring and the hope of new beginnings. The first sign of trouble came on a bright spring morning when Grace saw dust clouds on the horizon. She was hanging laundry outside while Wombley played on a blanket nearby, babbling happily at the dancing clotheslines. Dakota was in the barn, and Grace felt her heart skip a beat. When she realized the dust meant riders were coming, she quickly scooped up Wombley and ran to the barn. Someone's coming, she whispered urgently to Dakota. His face went serious immediately. Over the past month they had talked about this possibility many times. Dakota moved quickly to the back of the barn where Grace had prepared a hiding spot, behind some hay bales. But as the riders got closer, Grace could see there were too many of them. This wasn't just a neighbor stopping by for a visit. Stay hidden no matter what happens, Grace told Dakota, pressing Wombley into his arms. Don't come out unless I call for you. Grace walked back to the cabin, trying to look calm. She recognized some of the men as they rode into her yard. There was Reverend Mitchell from the church, along with Henry Peterson, who owned the general store in town. Behind them rode several other men from the community, including the territorial marshal, a stern man named Coleman. What worried Grace most was seeing her neighbor, old Henry, among them. He lived closest to her and would have been the most likely to notice unusual activity around her place. Marshal Coleman dismounted first. He was a big man with a thick mustache and cold eyes. Grace had never liked him, even before today. Morning. Mrs. Grace, he said, tipping his hat but not smiling. Mind if we have a word? Of course, Grace replied, forcing herself to sound normal. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. This isn't a social call, Coleman said bluntly. We've had some reports that concern us. Grace felt. Her stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. What kind of reports? Old Henry cleared his throat uncomfortably. Grace, I don't want to cause trouble, but I've been seeing smoke from your chimney at odd hours. And sometimes I hear voices carrying on the wind. I don't understand, Grace said, though she understood perfectly. Reverend Mitchell stepped forward. He was usually a kind man, but today his face was hard. Grace, we've heard rumors that you might be harboring Indians. With all the troubles we've been having, we need to make sure everyone in the community is safe. Harboring Indians? Grace tried to sound shocked. Why would you think such a thing? Because, Marshal Coleman said, walking closer to her, there's been reports of a survivor from that village that got destroyed last month. Army's been looking for him. Word is he's dangerous and might be hiding somewhere in this area. Grace's mind raced. How much did they actually know? Were they just fishing for information, or did someone actually see Lakota? I haven't seen any. Indians, Grace said, which was technically true since Lakota was Lakota, not just any Indian. Henry Peterson from the general store spoke up. Grace, you haven't been to town in over a month. You usually come in every 2 weeks for supplies. That's not like you. Grace realized they had been watching her more closely than she thought. I've been preserving food and making things last longer. Money's been tight since my husband passed. Mind if we take a look around? Marshal Coleman asked, but it wasn't really a question. Grace's heart pounded. Look around for what? Just to make sure everything's all right, Coleman said. Won't take but a minute. Grace knew she couldn't refuse without looking suspicious. Of course, she said. Though I don't know what you expect to find. The men began searching around her property. Grace tried to act normal, but inside she was panicking. What if Wombly started crying? What if one of the men went into the barn and found Lakota's hiding spot? As the men poked around her cabin and yard, Reverend Mitchell stayed close to Grace. You know, he said quietly, if you were in some kind of trouble, you could tell me. The church would help you. Grace looked at the Reverend, wondering if she could trust him. But then she remembered his sermon just 2 months ago about the Indian problem, and how the Lord wanted civilized people to tame the wilderness. She realized that even his kindness came with conditions. I'm not in any trouble, Reverend, she said firmly. That's when they heard it. A baby's cry coming from the direction of the barn. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Every man in the yard stopped what he was doing and turned toward the word. Sound. That sounded like a baby crying, Henry said, looking confused. Marshal Coleman's hand moved to his gun. Thought you said you were alone out here, Grace? Grace's mind went blank for a moment. Then desperately she said, Oh, that's just my cat. She's been making the strangest noises lately. I think she might be sick. But Wombly cried again, and this time there was no mistaking it for an animal sound. That's no cat, Coleman said grimly. He started walking toward the barn. Grace knew she had to make a choice. She could let them find Lakota and Wombly, or she could stand up for the family she had chosen. Stop, she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. The men all turned to look at her. Yes, there's a baby, Grace said, lifting her chin. His name is Winblimle, and I'm taking care of him. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace could see shock, anger, and disgust on the faces of men she had known for years. Is it ... is it an Indian baby? Reverend Mitchell asked quietly. He's a baby who needed help, Grace replied. And I gave it to him. Marshal Coleman's face turned red with anger. And the father? Where's the buck that brought this child here? Grace hated the way he said that word, but she kept her voice calm. His uncle brought him here. They were both hurt and hungry. I couldn't turn them away. His uncle? Coleman repeated. You mean there's a warrior here too? Before Grace could answer, Lakota stepped out of the barn. He was carrying Wombly, and Grace could see he had made his own choice. He wouldn't hide while she faced this alone. The men immediately reached for their weapons, but Lakota raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. Please, he said in English, no hurt, baby. Grace quickly moved to stand between Lakota and the men. He's not dangerous. He's been here for a month, helping me with the farm work. If he wanted to hurt anyone, he would have done it already. You've been living with a savage for a month? Henry Peterson asked, sounding horrified. I've been living with a man who lost his entire family and was trying to save his nephew, Grace shot back. And his name is Lakota, not Savage. Marshal Coleman kept his gun pointed at Lakota. Ma'am, you need to step away from him right now. No. Grace said firmly. Grace, Reverend Mitchell said, you don't understand what you're doing. These people are dangerous. They're not like us. You're right, Grace said, surprising everyone. They're not like us. When Dakota found me crying over my husband's grave, he didn't judge me. When I had nightmares about losing my son, he sat up with me. When winter storms threatened to destroy my roof, he fixed it without being asked. You want to know how he's different from us? He's kinder. The men looked uncomfortable, but Marshal Coleman wasn't backing down. I don't care if he built you a palace, Coleman said. The law is the law. I'm taking him in. For what crime? Grace demanded. For being a hostile Indian in violation of the Territorial Peace Treaty. He's not hostile, Grace said. Look at him. He's holding a baby. But Grace could see in their faces that it didn't matter what she said. These men had already made up their minds. In their eyes, Dakota was guilty of being born Lakota. That's when old Henry spoke up. Marshal, he said slowly, maybe we should think about this. Everyone turned to look at him in surprise. I mean, Henry continued, Grace has been my neighbor. For 3 years, she's never caused trouble. And if this Indian was dangerous, wouldn't something have happened by now? Grace felt a tiny spark of hope, but Marshal Coleman shook his head. The law doesn't care how long they've been playing house. I've got orders to bring in any hostiles, and that's what I'm doing. Then you'll have to arrest me too, Grace said. Quietly. What? Coleman looked confused. If you're arresting Dakota for living here, then you have to arrest me for harboring him, Grace said. And if you take Wombly away from me, you're taking a baby from the only mother he's known. Grace moved closer to Dakota and gently took Wombly from his arms. The baby looked up at her and smiled, reaching for her face with his tiny hands. Look at him, Grace said to the men. Does this look like a child who's been mistreated? Does this look like a dangerous situation? For the first time, some of the men looked uncertain. Wombly was clearly healthy and happy, and the love between him and Grace was obvious to anyone with eyes, but Grace knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Grace held Wombly close to her chest while Dakota stood beside her, his hands still raised to show he meant no harm. The men on horseback whispered among themselves, clearly uncertain about what to do next. Marshal Coleman was the first to break the tense silence. Mrs. Grace, you're making this harder than it needs to be? Step away from the Indian and hand over the child. We'll make sure the baby gets to the proper authorities. The proper authorities? Grace's voice rose with anger. You mean you'll take him away from the only family he has left and put him in some government facility, where he'll be just another number? It's for his own good, Reverend Mitchell said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. He needs to be with his own people. His own people are dead, Grace said bluntly. Dakota and I are his people now. That's when they all heard the sound of more horses approaching. Grace felt her heart sink, thinking more men had come to take Dakota away. But when she looked toward the horizon, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A group of Lakota warriors was riding toward the cabin, and they were coming fast. Well, now we've got real trouble, Marshal Coleman muttered. Raising his rifle, Grace recognized the lead rider immediately. It was an older man with long gray hair and traditional Lakota clothing. Even from a distance, she could see the authority in the way he sat his horse. This had to be a chief or elder. Nobody shoot, Grace called out desperately. Let me talk to them. Like hell, Coleman replied. We're outnumbered now. But Grace was already walking toward the approaching riders, still holding Wombly. Dakota quickly moved to her side, speaking urgently in Lakota. What's he saying? Coleman demanded. He's telling me that's his uncle, Grace said. Chief Mapia. He's been looking for them. The Lakota riders slowed as they approached, and Grace could see they were just as tense as the white men. Everyone had their hands near their weapons, and one wrong move could turn this into a tragedy. Chief Mapia dismounted and walked toward Grace and Dakota. He was an impressive man, probably in his 60s, with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to see everything. When he spoke, it was in Lakota, directed at Tia Ko. Grace watched as the two men had a rapid conversation in their native language. She couldn't understand the words, but she could read the emotions on their faces. There was relief, concern, and something that looked like anger. Finally, Chief Mapia turned his attention to Grace. When he spoke, his English was much better than Dakota's. "You are the woman who saved my nephew and his sister's child," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Grace replied simply. The chief looked at Wamble, who was now reaching toward Dakota with his little arms. "The child looks healthy." "You have cared for him well." "I love him," Grace said, and she could hear her voice breaking. "I love them both." Chief Mapia studied her face for a long moment. "Dakota has told me many things. He says you fed the child from your own body when he was starving." Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, aware that all the white men were listening to every word. "He needed milk. I was able to provide it. And you asked for nothing in return?" "They're my family now," Grace said. "Family doesn't ask for payment." Behind them, Marshal Coleman was getting impatient. "Look, Chief, I don't know what kind of arrangement you people have worked out here, but I've got a job to do." "That Indian is coming with me." Chief Mapia turned to face the marshal, and Grace could see the steel in his eyes. "My nephew has committed no crime. He's a hostile Indian who's been living illegally on settler land," Coleman replied. "He is a man who saved a child's life and was given shelter by a kind woman," the chief said calmly. "Where is the crime in this?" Old Henry spoke up again. "Marshal, maybe we should hear them out. This isn't what we expected to find." But Coleman was determined. "I don't care what we expected. The law is the law." That's when Chief Mapia surprised everyone. He walked over to Grace and gently placed his hand on Wamble's head. "This child has lost his parents," he said, speaking to the group of white men. "In our tradition, when parents die, the child belongs to the family that can best care for him. This woman has proven she can care for him. She has proven she loves him." "But he's an Indian child," Reverend Mitchell protested. "He should be raised by Indians." "He should be raised by people who love him," Chief Mapia replied. "Color of skin does not determine the color of heart." Grace felt tears starting to flow down her cheeks. She had never expected support from this direction. The chief continued talking, but now he was addressing his own men in Lakota. Grace could see some of them nodding, while others looked uncertain. Finally, one of the younger warriors spoke up. Sounding angry, Dakota quickly responded, and Grace could tell he was defending her. The conversation grew heated, with several men talking at once. "What are they saying?" Grace asked quietly. Chief Mapia turned back to her. "Some of my men believe the child should return to our people. They say it is not right for a white woman to raise a Lakota boy." Grace felt her heart breaking. After everything they had been through, after all the love and care she had poured into Wamble, was she going to lose him anyway? "But," the chief continued, "I have told them what Dakota has told me. You did not just feed this child and keep him warm. You mourned with us. When Dakota told you about our people who died, you cried. When he showed you our ways, you learned. You did not try to make Wamble forget he is Lakota. You asked Dakota to teach you our words so you could speak to the child in his own language." Grace nodded, unable to speak. "This is not a white woman stealing an Indian child," Chief Mapia said, now addressing both groups of men. "This is a mother who happened to find a son who needed her." Marshal Coleman was getting frustrated. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change anything. I still have my orders." "Your orders," Chief Mapia said, "were to find hostile Indians. Do you see any hostiles here?" The chief gestured around the peaceful scene. Grace was holding a happy baby, Dakota was clearly no threat to anyone, and the conversation, while tense, had been respectful on all sides. "I see an Indian who's been living where he shouldn't be," Coleman insisted. "You see a man who was given shelter by a neighbor," Old Henry said unexpectedly. "Marshal, I've been thinking about this. If Grace wants to have guests on her own property, that's her business. It's not that simple," Coleman replied. "Maybe it is," Henry said. "Grace, have you ever felt threatened by Dakota?" "Never," Grace said immediately. "He's been nothing but helpful and kind. Has he ever tried to harm you or anyone else?" "No, he saved my life during a blizzard last month when I got lost coming back from the creek." Henry nodded. And the baby, has caring for him been a burden? Grace looked down at Wombley, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms. He's been a blessing. The greatest blessing I've ever known. Then I don't see the problem, Henry said. Seems to me like 3 people found each other when they all needed family. Isn't that what neighbors are supposed to do? Help each other? Reverend Mitchell looked uncomfortable. Henry, you're talking about a white woman raising an Indian child? What will people think? People will think what they want to think regardless, Henry replied. But I know Grace, and I can see she loves that baby, and I can see he loves her too. Sometimes that's all that matters. Chief Mapia smiled for the first time since arriving. The old man speaks wisdom. Grace felt a flutter of hope. Could this really work out? Could they actually convince everyone to let them stay together? But she could see that Marshal Coleman wasn't giving up, and some of the Lakota warriors still looked unhappy. The biggest test was still coming, and Grace wasn't sure she was ready for what happened next. The moment that would change everything came when little Wombley woke up in Grace's arms and began to fuss. Without thinking, Grace started speaking to him in the Lakota words Dakota had taught her. Istinma, Wombley, she said softly, which meant, go to sleep, Eagle. She gently rocked him and continued whispering in his native language, Aina Kisi Un, meaning, Mama is here. The effect on everyone watching was immediate. Chief Mapia's eyebrows rose in surprise, while his warriors looked at each other with expressions of amazement. Even Marshal Coleman seemed taken aback. She speaks our language, one of the younger Lakota men said in English, sounding shocked. Dakota stepped forward and spoke to his uncle in Lakota. Grace caught some of the words. He was explaining how Grace had asked him to teach her so she could talk to Wombley in both languages. Chief Mapia walked closer to Grace. Show me more, he said quietly. Grace felt nervous but continued. She pointed to Wombley's nose and said, Pasu, then to his eyes and said, Ista. She counted his tiny fingers in Lakota, Wonjila, Nunpa, Yamni, which meant 1, 2, 3. Wombley giggled at the sound of her voice, reaching up to touch her face. Grace smiled and said, Teka waist, meaning good baby. Incredible, Chief, Mapia murmured. He turned to his men and spoke rapidly in Lakota. Grace could tell he was explaining what he had just witnessed. Meanwhile, the white men were having their own reaction. Reverend Mitchell looked troubled. Grace, you've been teaching yourself heathen language? Before Grace could answer, old Henry spoke up again. Reverend, seems to me she's been learning the baby's language so she can be a better mother to him. What's heathen about that? It's not natural, another man said. White children should speak English. Wombley isn't just any white child's child, Grace said firmly. He's Lakota, and he deserves to know his heritage. I want him to be proud of who he is. Chief Mapia nodded approvingly. This woman understands. What many do not. A child without knowledge of his people is like a tree without roots. Marshal Coleman was getting frustrated with the whole situation. This is all very interesting, but it doesn't solve the legal problem. I still have my orders. That's when Chief Mapia made a proposal that surprised everyone. Marshal, he said, what if there was no legal problem? What do you mean? The chief smiled. In Lakota tradition, when someone saves a child's life and cares for him as their own, they can be adopted into the tribe. They become family. Grace felt her heart skip a beat. Adopted into the tribe? If you wish it, Chief Mapia said. You would become Wombley's mother not just in your heart, but in the eyes of our people. And Dakota would be recognized as his uncle and your protector. But she's white, one of the Lakota warriors protested. Chief Mapia turned to face his own men. Color is something we see with our eyes. Love is something we feel with our hearts. This woman has shown more love for one of our children than some of our own people show. He looked back at Grace. There is more. If you become part of our tribe, then legally you would be living on land that belongs to us, not to the white government. The marshal would have no authority over what happens in a Lakota family. Marshal Coleman's face turned red. Now wait just a minute. You can't just make white people into Indians. Can you make Indians into white people? Chief Mapia asked calmly. Your government has tried to do exactly that with our children in your schools." The comparison clearly made Coleman uncomfortable, and Grace could see some of the other white men shifting uneasily. "Besides," the chief continued, "this would not be the first time. There have been white people adopted into tribes before. It is not common, but it is not unheard of." Grace looked at Lakota, who was watching her with hopeful eyes. Then she looked down at Wombly, who was now playing with her hair and babbling happily. "What would this mean exactly?" she asked. "You would be given a Lakota name," Chief Mapia explained. "You would be part of our family. Wombly would grow up knowing both worlds, yours and ours. He would learn your ways and our ways. And Lakota? Lakota would remain here with you, helping to raise his nephew and protecting both of you. He would also serve as a bridge between our people and the white settlers, helping prevent misunderstandings that lead to violence." Grace felt tears coming to her eyes. It was more than she had dared to hope for. "And you would really accept me? Even though I'm white?" Chief Mapia smiled. "You have already proven yourself. You fed our child when he was hungry. You healed our warrior when he was wounded. You learned our language to honor our culture. Most importantly, you loved without asking for anything in return. These are the qualities we value most." Old Henry spoke up from behind them. "Grace, I think you should do it." Everyone turned to look at him in surprise. "I mean it," Henry continued. "I've been watching you for the past month, wondering why you seem different. Now I know. You've, been happy. Happier than I've seen you since your husband died. If this makes you a family, then it's the right thing to do." Reverend Mitchell looked troubled. "Henry, you're talking about a Christian woman joining with heathens." "I'm talking about a woman who found her calling taking care of people who needed her," Henry replied. "Seems pretty Christian to me." Grace looked around at all the faces watching her, white men who thought she was making a mistake, Lakota warriors who were still uncertain about accepting her, Lakota who was hoping she would say yes, and Chief Mapia who was offering her something she had never imagined possible. "What would my name be?" she asked quietly. Chief Mapia thought for a moment. "Fante Waste," he said. "It means good heart. It is a name that honors what you have done." Grace repeated the name softly. Fante Waste. It sounded beautiful, too. Her ears, Wombly chose that moment to reach up and touch her face again, making a happy sound that melted everyone's heart. "Yes," Grace said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, I accept." The ceremony took place right there in Grace's yard, with both communities watching. Chief Mapia spoke words in Lakota while Grace held Wombly. Some of the white men rode away in disgust, but others stayed to witness this historic moment. When it was over, Grace was officially Fante Waste, mother to Wombly and member of Chief Mapia's tribe. Marshal Coleman had no choice but to leave without his prisoner, since he had no jurisdiction over tribal family matters. As the sun began to set, most of the riders departed. Chief Mapia and a few of his men stayed for dinner, sharing stories and making plans for how this new arrangement would work. "You will always be welcome in our village," the chief told Grace. "And we will visit here often to make sure Wombly knows his people." "And our people will learn to know Grace," Lakota added, speaking more English than Grace had ever heard from him. That night, after everyone had gone, Grace sat by the fire with Lakota and Wombly. The baby was sleeping peacefully in her arms, and Lakota was carving a small toy horse for him. "Are you happy with what happened today?" Grace asked. Tete KO'd up from his carving. "Very happy. Now Wombly has what every child needs, a mother who loves him, an uncle who protects him, and a tribe that claims him." "And what about you? Are you happy staying here?" Lakota smiled. "This is home now. You gave me and Wombly a home when we had lost everything. Now we give you family when you were alone." Grace felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "We're really a family now, aren't we?" "We were always family," Lakota said. "Today we just made it official." Years later, when Wombly was grown and had children of his own, he would tell them the story of the white woman who became Lakota because love is stronger than fear, and family is stronger than the color of skin. Grace's little cabin became a place where two worlds met in peace. proving that sometimes the most unlikely families are the ones that last forever.